The Director General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, says the biggest economic stimulus for developing countries is access to COVID vaccine. Speaking at the 2021 International Monetary Fund Spring Meetings, Okonjo-Iweala says the lack of adequate vaccine has both economic and health impacts for developing countries. Over 690 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines are reported to have been administered globally. But the World Health Organization says Africa has received less than 2% of that figure.
Let me just say that before we talk of economic impact, we have to look at the health impact. Because the biggest thing for economic recovery for developing countries is getting the vaccines that they need in order to deal with the pandemic. I often say the biggest economic stimulus for developing countries would be access to these vaccines. So that's the first. But developing countries have been hit in so many ways. Commodity exporters have faced plummeting prices. Travel and tourism for those countries that depend on this has collapsed in many countries. And even those well integrated into global value chains, they've suffered from some of the closures of factories and borders and so on. So there's been a lot of impact on developing countries. And as you can see, for 36 years, poverty has been declining. From a figure of about 3 decades now, poverty has been declining. And in 1990, 36% of people were living in extreme poverty. Now, in 2018, this fell quite substantially to about 10%. And now, for the first time, it's climbing back up. And the World Bank projects that 150 million people could fall back into poverty. So you can see how the impact of this has really been very dramatic.
All right, for a closer look at this, we're now being joined by Professor Banji Oyeyinka, the Special Advisor to the President of the African Development Bank. Thank you so much for joining us on NewsNight. I'm sure you listened to the DG of the WTO there, and I mean, what she is projecting is really, really very serious. If developing nations don't come in very quickly, economy-wise, to help African countries. What do you make of the fact that only 2% of the 650 million vaccine rolled out in Africa, well, globally, Africa has only 2% of it?
No, it's not surprising. What we have now is what you might call vaccine nationalism. Countries are taking care of themselves. And if you were in their shoes, maybe you do the same. So this is why, of course, there's COVAX, which WHO is promoting. And I know the DG has also been a big advocate of this. So what we need to do is recover and ensure this doesn't happen to us again in the future. Right now, what you have is an appeal to the SDR, the special drawing rights of the IMF, for countries to be able to draw more on their reserves that they have had with the IMF. It's a facility that is used in crises such as this. Right now, according to our estimates, Africa will be able to draw about $32.2 billion, according to what they have. This would just be about 6.4% of the whole $500 billion. But if the G7, for example, as people are now appealing, among which is Dr. Akuma Adesina and all the others, saying, look, the rich countries already have more than they need. So if they can forego their own allocation, Africa will be able to draw close to $160 billion, and that will help a lot in the recovery effort.
So if we're talking of drawing that much money, we still have to think about the issue of manufacturing, and India is saying they have to look after their own people. AstraZeneca, there are issues there, Johnson & Johnson, and then America is definitely buying as much as they can, and then Canada is buying more than double the amount they need for their entire nation, more than the population. So what do we do even if we draw the money from IMF?
So what we should do is not use the money to service debt. What we should do is to use the money towards quick recovery, a resilient economy built across Africa over a long time, I have always advocated that Africa needs to diversify its economies. We said it so many times. And what the DG was talking about is what we've experienced time after time, every crisis. 2016, 1973, 1972. As long as a nation or much of the region in Africa depends on a single commodity like minerals and oil, each time there's a crisis such as this, we are back to square one. So I think the lesson of the 50-odd years of development is that we need to seriously rethink development in Africa and industrialize our economies. Industrialize doesn't mean you are going to build rockets or building aeroplanes. It simply means you want to transit from hoe and cutlass to making your food, to growing your food and so forth with the modern technologies. It means, for example, that you'll be converting cotton to textiles, to clothing, to garment. It means, for example, that you move away from eating pomo and using it to make leather bags and shoes.
Okay.
So this is what we are talking about.
Okay. All right, Prof, please hold on. Just hold your breath. And we're taking a short break. Plenty more still ahead, including a look at the Nigerian political structure. Former Emir of Kano says the country is economically unsustainable as it is. Do stay with us, and when we come back, Prof will continue the conversation.
Welcome back. You're watching NewsNight. Our guest tonight is still Professor Banji Oyeyinka. He's the special advisor to President of the African Development Bank. Before I went on that break, well, thank you very much, of course, for staying with us. Before I went on the break, you were talking about how, it's very important for Africa to industrialize. And I wonder how exactly that can happen. And then, of course, Konja talks about the biggest economic stimulus for developing countries being COVID-19 vaccines. What kind of stimulus are we looking at? Can you help us break it down?
So right now, as I said earlier, we have the COVAX angle. We also have the possibility of this special drawing rights that Africans, I think it's been generally agreed since March 19 by G7 that this is going to happen. So the size of it is what we should look at now. I believe if we get the $160 billion, it's going to be a big boost to African economies. But beyond that, as you said, industrialization is a long-term initiative. It's something we should pursue relentlessly, continually.
But what are the baby steps that we need to take?
So the baby step now is where, for example, we have been pushing in this country agriculture. Not agriculture in the ways we used to do it. Agriculture in a modern sense. The transition from the old agricultural practices of using very simple implements to using modern equipments, to using modern inputs. I'll give you an example. In Sudan recently, Africa Development Bank helped that country to convert, to supply what we call heat-resistant varieties of wheat. Okay. In a zone where they used to basically just grow cotton because it's extremely very hot. This year, they grew 800,000 acres of wheat. Suddenly, Sudan is self-sufficient in wheat, 50%. This is the kind of inputs we are talking about. And when you use modern equipment, I mean, one tractor could do what 200 farmers can do in one day. That is the kind of agriculture we are talking about.
So in terms of the support, for example, if we take it to the realm of what AFDB is trying to do with Nigeria and across the continent, what kind of money are we looking at to restructure our agriculture to make it such that the entire value chain works for us so that we're not exporting cocoa instead of exporting chocolate?
No, thank you very much. Right now, this year, and this is why I'm here actually in the country, we have $250 million committed to jumpstart the special agro-industrial processing zone that we are talking about. We're already in 7 countries all over Africa. Ethiopia, for example, is in phase 2. The biggest of the zones is Nigeria. And this year, we believe that this is going to start. What does it do? Basically, you try to close all the infrastructure deficit in all the areas where we don't have roads, where we don't have irrigation, where we need all manner of things to bridge the gap between farmers and the processors, and of course the market. So you close the logistic gap and ensure that you have a closed supply chain. This is what modern agriculture does.
Now, with this funding, will you be disbursing to governments, whether at the federal level or state, or are you going to be engaging directly with the farmers?
Yes. So there are two sides to it. The government, federal government is a borrower on behalf of the states because the locations are going to be within states. There are 6 zones in the country. This week, for example, our colleagues have gone to 6 states. We are establishing all the locational parameters. But the money is to build the zones. We are trying to find the best formula to ensure that this money goes to the zone. This other dimension is that we also have Bank of Industry committed $1 billion to lend to every company that locates in those zones. We have several other partners. IFAD is bringing $100 million. So this is a big thing. We hope we're able to pull it through as quickly as possible, because this is a way to eliminate poverty as quickly as possible.
Would you, as African Development Bank, also subscribe to the idea of a debt freeze for African countries and other developing countries because, of course, of the impact of COVID-19?
Yes, of course. The danger, of course, the most difficult part of the debt issue is the private debt. It's about 40%. This is why it's different from the time we had in the past. Much of the debt by African countries this time around is actually 40% in private hands. If you default, actually, you are going to be in trouble.
So when you said that private debt,
yeah.
From private individuals rather than government?
Private companies, private lenders. You know, these days everyone goes to the bond market and borrow. In the past, it's usually about Norway borrows you, somebody borrows you. But what we see, and you find the African Economic Outlook for this year for Africa Development Bank is actually on the debt. It's a fantastic document that those who are interested should read. The most difficult part of the debt issue this time around is much of it is private debt.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Professor Banji Oyeyinka, Special Advisor to President of the African Development Bank. Thank you so much for joining us and, of course, your great insights.